The first presentation is by Valentina Gajardo and is about the work of Francisca Aninat. Ruth Jones, who is doing the next paper on the work of Emily Perry, is unfortunately unwell, but she has very kindly recorded herself speaking over her slides. So we will show the slides, and then she will join us through for the Q&A through Zoom, if we can figure out how to make that happen. And then the final paper will be about the Women's Art Collection as an experience of feminist scenography by Dr. Susannah Henry, and the Q&A will be chaired by Dr. Amy Tobin. So I'll pass over to you, Valentina.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you. I came all the way from Chile so hopefully to talk about this thread stories, symptom and narrative of time in the artwork of our Chilean artist Francisca Aninat. This is part of my aim. This is part of my master's research that I already finished. But this is a starting point. Hopefully some of you will know this work that is part of the Women's Arts Collection here. So this is in Cambridge, and you would see that this abstract artwork has been created with different fragments, stitches, papers, newspapers, so you will be able to see some vestiges on the cloth. So let me introduce this my paper a little bit. So new questions have emerged in our Chilean and Latin American art scene during the return to democracy, and so they are latent and dormant symptoms, and our artists are working nowadays trying to connect those symptoms and narratives to express their daily lives. So these are collaborative, symptomatic and fragmented practices, and this would be a new artistic dialogue in our country to think about our current times over there. So my presentation is divided into three parts. The first one is to give you a little bit of context and background about this Chilean context. The second one will be more focused on the thread as a reconstitution of time, the materiality and the thread as matter in itself. And to finish with this thread stories, I would like to show you more of Francisca Aninat's work. So the objective would be to analyze these collaborative works, to reconstitute these forgotten times of transient communities, which the artist, she's always working with them to really show us or to bring those unnoticed voices and overlooked times. And finally reflect upon the symptom and narrative as one movement all together. And so this is the artist. She studied in art in Chile. Later she came to Central St. Martin's. She lives in London, and she would like to question the painting materiality, the displacement of the fabric, to rethink the place of the viewer. Hopefully I will show you some of her recent works so you understand all these points of view better. And she's always interested in those, she calls them dead moments, those routines, those everyday moments where transient communities, women, immigrants, hospital patients are in silence, awaiting. So this is how she works, with fragments, with stitches, with all the stitches of all these transient communities. I will try to explain better later on. So my proposal is that the thread appears both in symptom and narrative in her work. This is more like presenting the times of these people more than representing. And so these threads and stitches have become traces of Aninat's work of art. And while she weaves these works in collaboration, she's also weaving our Chilean institution times, a poor health system, latent dictatorship, symptoms, also ancestral times, the times of the artist herself. So we will be able to see how they're all interconnected. So my point of view of the symptom will be understood from art historian George Didi Hooverman point of view. This would be a fragile symptom self-presented in the image. I'm interested in this surviving times and in those traces which the artist presents, hides and unveils. So there is always a connection between what she's weaving and all these times that tend to appear in her artwork. So the symptom presents and conceals and adds tension to the image. And so from a Freudian point of view, this would be a contradiction if you join symptom and narrative all together. But in the artwork, it works very well because it affects the image with poetic narrative. So to start with, I will be talking about two of her artworks, white paintings and arbillera. Uruguayan art historian Ruth described our art scene, or Latin American artworks that were assemblage of fragments of time. They were politically involved. They worked as a political resistance. So they incorporated objects and they recontextualized objects and words in order to resist to power. And there's another, this art critic and curator Guy Brett, which I like because he was very close to the artist. He did lots of essays about her work, and he described this new generations of artists connecting in a public and artistic public dialogue. And these are artists that I'm very interested in, perhaps later on talk to you about. And so this is a generation trying to work with fragmented works, but to really show some of the symptoms. So he also talked about the string in Aninat's work. You would know artist Cecilia Vicuña, perhaps. There's a beautiful exhibition, textile exhibition at the Barbican now. I believe she was at the Tate Modern as well. So she's always connecting these fragments, parts described by Luis Kamnitzer. She has a political resistance here as well. She writes poetry. You may know her very well. And there's another contemporary artist, Monica Bengoa, for example. She argues about handmade or machine-made objects or embroideries, and so she questions the materiality of the thread. And here we are with Francisca Aninat's one of her first works, white paintings, and you can see how she, perhaps here you can see better, how she started painting the canvases, tearing them up and sewing them again. So the thread became really, really important in her work. And so Guy Brett described this as beautifully loosely, tightly bound, because you can see the fragility here, but also the thread is putting all the work together. And so this leads us to this arbillera dress, where she incorporates other elements and also vestiges. You can see some numbers there written on the burlap. You can see also newspaper and all the stitches created by the artist herself. And a reference for this arbillera, Violeta Parra, she's beautifully displayed now at the Barbican, as well as one of her works there. She was poet, singer, artist, activist, and she was representing like our social symptoms through these arpilleras. That later, during dictatorship, there were several workshops, the most famous one in Vicaría de la Solidaridad, where women gathered to start sewing their stories while they were remembering the lost ones. So it became a way of expressing events and to really describe what was happening in the country, but also a way of living as well while they were waiting or trying to know about their beloved ones. And so Francisca and Aninat moved further here, and she connects all of these fragments, collaborative practice, symptoms in her work. So I would like to describe this, observing two of her works, Waiting Exercises and Patio de Luz, where the thread would work as trace and vestige. And this would be a way, the thread would be a way of returning to those lived times, to try to touch those moments that are left behind, those moments that have been unnoticed or overlooked. And so these are also personal and collective times all gathered in her artwork. So there are two moments of this artworks, Waiting Exercises and Patio de Luz. She developed this project throughout 7 years in a Chilean hospital, one of our most important hospitals, San Juan de Dios Hospital, where she invited people to weave, to work, to stitch the little canvases she took to that place. And so in the silence of the waiting room, they started weaving the little objects. She described this quote, this is a quote of the artist. She described this institution as a very heavy, poor, uncanny institution, tremendous institution, but she was telling how she felt that death was hovering around, but she also wanted to understand the institution better. So these are the objects all created during this waiting exercises while patients were waiting to there in the waiting rooms. For you to understand, in our country, to come to this medical institution takes months and months, and so the waiting and anxiety comes really, really, it's like an embodied experience, really. And so if you see all these objects that came out of this silent work during years, have talismans, have little objects that are made there in relation with them. This was displayed in Museo de la Memoria and Human y Derechos Humanos in Santiago de Chile, and so it was an interesting exhibition where the artist showed all of these objects created there in the institution. So symptom and silence are interwoven in her work. The symptoms appear silently. And it talks about what has remained hidden. And so Aninat here is talking about ancestral, individual, and collective times. There's another moment in the hospital. It's a project called Patio de Luz, where she started interviewing patients, doctors, workers there at the hospital. And while she was interviewing them, the artist gave them a paper and some ink or some pen, and they were drawing just what they were remembering while they were telling some stories they remembered about the institution. And so the artist then came back to her studio and weaved them all together in these books. She created several books in this Patio de Luz exhibition where you can see really all these layers of memories, layers of time here, where you could see the interviews, drawings, the artist stitches, also some of the canvases, the fragments of canvases collected during the waiting exercises. So, for example, this is one of the stories revealed by one of the doctors who said that he was hidden for more than 30 days in the corpse's deposit, for example. So while she weaves and stitches all these works together, you can see how different times are brought to the present. And the art historian Soledad Garcia describes these beautiful books like human parchments, really. She said that these books are porous like the skin. They have layers and traces of the body, and you can see how thick they are. They have their own materiality, so that's why it's interesting in this session to talk about the thread here with the presence of itself that will connect us with the meaning of the artwork. And here to finish, this is the third part, the thread stories, where symptom and narrative of time come together. It's beautiful how the artist describes. She really writes with stitches. And I will show you two of her artworks, South American series and biographical notes. Again, from Didi Huberman's perspective, so the symptom present in the artwork would be an intrusion, would be a moment that comes really to our present, and it would affect the image. So what the artist is trying to do is really to touch those lived times and this to express like what she has been working upon during all these years while visiting our institutions, while working with transient communities, while creating workshops with immigrants. So these are the little fragments also, all stitched during the waiting rooms. And the next image, I think you would be very interested to see, is how the artist collects all of these little pieces and puts them all together. And so this is the impressive part where all these times really come together. You would see words, stitches. If you come very close, you can touch them. There's a tactile experience here, and how she interacts with the viewer, putting her artwork on the floor. You see, it's not on the wall anymore, it's on the floor. So it really affects the viewer as well. And here's another of these works. This is number 6 of the South American series. And you would see here how she's also talking about our geography, our Chilean landscape. Guy Brett also said that we Chileans always live on the edge, on the edge of the mountains, on the edge of the sea. With this, we have lots of, the ground is always shaking, so we always live on this edge. And the mountains and the sea are very important to us. The presence of the Andes Mountains is very important to us. So you would see some traces of this in her artwork, while you discover, if you come close and close, more of these notes and traces as she describes them, or this written times written with stitches to tell the stories of the unnoticed ones. So that's very important. So this is another of the South American series. This is number 4. And you would be able to move around the work, to touch it, to really feel the materiality of these fragments. If you come closer, you can see all the different stitches, colors, words there. And she has been recently working also incorporating some ancestral times, with some Mayan codex and her own writings, all connected with the ones created during her stay at the hospital. All of this you can recognize there, the inks done in the interviews, some of her new embroideries, and all of the works done by these waiting patients. And so to conclude, writing with stitches seems to be the key in Aninat's work. She's trying to touch those surviving times, suspended times of our Chilean institutions, to touch really what is not longer there, but to make it visible, to make these living times visible, and to write these thread stories with stitches. So thank you very much for listening.
Emily Perry's performance piece, Narcissus Nature Maud Mukbang, was created as a response to cocaine, a photographic series of works by Gail Chongquan, and took part at Murray Edwards College in 2022. As the audience first encounter the performance of Emily Perry's work, Narcissus Nature Maud Mukbang, they are met with 3 women, appropriate to the setting of Murray Edwards College, wearing aprons, pale stretched denim, muted t-shirts, natural hair, and little obvious makeup. These women take the large and somewhat nervous audience outside for a guided meditation, bending to dig up the ground with cutlery. Next, they encourage the audience to pick daffodils and lead them through the gardens to delve through raised beds, squeeze clay, and wipe their hands on tea towels before slowly ambling back to the fellows' drawing room. Here, the performers recline and examine themselves in hand mirrors that have QR codes on the reverse surface, briefly leaving the audience directionless until they abruptly decide to enter the dining room. Hereafter, the audience are invited to sit at 3 long tables loaded with fresh bread, fruit and salad. Each table is headed by both a large format photograph from Gail Chongquan's series Cocaine and a performer, and the audience begin to eat. Care is not explicitly mentioned by Perry in this piece. However, the roles each of the women perform, in aprons, guiding meditation, sharing information, leading the audience on a walk, hosting a dinner, are typical of a caregiver. And the entire performance is a performance of gendered labour, essentially caregiving. At first, the audience rely heavily on guidance from the performers, unsure of their surroundings or what to do, watching closely, confused, trying to follow instructions.
Sorry.
In Moral Boundaries, Joan Tronto discusses care as a complex cultural construction that allows us to see the embodiments of our abstract ideas about power and relationships. Tronto believes care makes the power relationships in our society visible. Returning to Perry's performance, I'd like to connect these 2 ideas together, that through the 3 caregivers and the audience's responses to them, underlying power relationships become visible. The way the women are viewed and treated as the performance progresses undergoes a number of changes. Quiet at first, as they try to make sense of the absurd phrases being uttered deadly seriously by the performers, watching them cut up the lawn with a knife and fork as if it were lunch. The audience hesitantly follow the performers to pick flowers, some choosing to abstain. For the most part, the audience treats the women with respect. When the audience return from the guided walk to find the performers regarding themselves in wooden handheld mirrors, there is a change in atmosphere. The audience that had previously been participants, willing if somewhat confused pawns in the performer's tour, now revert back to being an art audience, consuming the women's appearances, pulling out phones and scanning the QR codes on the reverse of the mirrors without asking permission, jostling one another to get to the women and photograph them. The placement of the QR codes on the reverse of the mirrors means that the audience has to choose to invade the space of the women holding those mirrors. They are in a non-responsive state when looking in the mirrors, and the audience is invited to objectify them further. This is an uncomfortable moment in which the audience witness each other treating the women as objects to be photographed. There's a performance to be experienced. Lastly, the audience follow the performers as they move to the dining room, and there is a rush. Initially, looking to the women who head each table, the audience gradually descends into its own self-governing dinner table politics, with little attention paid to the performers. Passing food across one another, requesting water, examining the glass plates balanced on tiny polymer clay fruits and vegetables, chatting with strangers, and breaking the tension from the previous 20 minutes in which they did as they were told. All the while, the three women performers are shouting, staring straight ahead, holding daffodils, and inviting their audience to eat, stop eating, savor, enjoy. Periodically, they are looked at, and then, inevitably, conversation and eating resumes. Some people have gathered the idea to place their phones underneath the glass plates so they can watch the film linked to the QR code from earlier, dissociating from the dining chaos as they idly consume images of women ingesting massive quantities of food. Others are trying to pay some attention to the performers as they cry out their contradictory commands in increasingly manic tones and at shorter intervals, and they try to feed them, offer them water, before giving up and returning to their food. The performance of care by the three women in Narcissus Nature Mort Mukbang highlights where it is and isn't acceptable to value those who care for us. Returning to Joan Tronto again and her assertion that care makes power relationships visible, she suggests our fear of dependency on a caregiver translates to a fear that we no longer hold our own sense of autonomy. In a society that values the autonomous individual, the caregivers that look after basic needs are not valued. As the audience sit to eat, scroll mindlessly on their phones and chat with each other, the three women at the heads of the table have served their purpose. They have been rendered flat and dimensionless through their role as caregivers. Perry often makes use of delegated performance in her work. Each of the women in this performance is a student or local to Cambridge and not an artist or actor. They look very much the part of an understated but comfortable middle-class woman, the sort we've been conditioned to believe inhabits cities like Cambridge. The choice to delegate a performance rather than perform it from the artist's perspective is discussed by Claire Bishop in Artificial Hells. Delegating the performance affords the work a sense of authenticity, as the performers are often selected to perform their own socio-economic category, be this on the basis of gender, class, ethnicity, age, or disability. In this case, the women chosen lend the weight of credibility to the character of the neutral-toned, fresh-faced, healthy middle-class woman about to do some gardening before heading in to make a nutritious lunch for the family and feed the Labrador. Playing with the stereotypical tropes of women is a shorthand that allows the audience to accept the performers as native to the site, causing more interesting dynamics to come to the fore rather than the cognitive dissonance that might occur with performers who might not seem as at home in the setting of Murray Edwards College. Bishop asserts that for delegated performance to be successful, among other things, it should produce disruptive events that testify to a shared reality between viewers and performers that defy the agreed ways of how we think about pleasure, labour and ethics, but also the intellectual frameworks we have inherited to understand these ideas today. In Women with Salad, her performers repeatedly execute the same monotonous action, becoming what Perry terms living gifts. In Gender Trouble, Judith Butler discusses parody and repetition in relation to the performance of gender and considers the transformative quality of such deformed acts. Butler warns against considering gender as the block from which women build their identities. Her contention is that the stylized, repetitive acts that women perform over time are what creates their gender as an identity. She sees the possibility for transformation as possible through a parodic repetition that exposes the phantasmic effect of abiding identity as a politically tenuous construction. In a sense, it seems, that a reclamation of agency can be found in the parodic performance of gender. Perry's performances are studied, stylized acts that she delegates. The possibility for transformation through parodic performance is not, however, afforded to the performers. These performers are, after all, performing their socio-economic status, some element of their identity that they cannot escape, chosen for its authenticity. The possibility for transformation comes through the audience, who recognise the parodic, repetitive acts that women perform as prescribed and sanctioned by society for the phantasmic reality that they are. Perry's use of delegation in performance could be considered a feminist strategy. Perry usually interviews performers ahead of time to talk about the work, taking great care to contextualise the motivation for the performance, checking that it will align with their values. The transformative possibility for the performers comes through their shared investment in making apparent the frameworks misogyny operates within, and by revealing internalised ideologies. Working in response to other women artists to amplify one another's work is a long-standing feminist strategy. Perry carefully considers Gail Chong Kwan's work and the collection of works in the Women's Art Collection before creating Narcissus Nature Mukbang, weaving references to Chong Kwan's work throughout, whilst maintaining her own distinct voice. Gail Chong Kwan's Cocaine from 2007 explores food wastage and consumption, presenting us with expansive landscapes made entirely of slowly decomposing food in the form of large format photographs, carefully echoing the theme of cocaine, a medieval myth of a place of plenty, luxury and ease. Perry simultaneously highlights and presents to the audience the online cultural phenomenon of the mukbang, a continual consumption of large quantities of food by a host who talks to their audience whilst eating. Indeed, we are encouraged to view a collection of the women who conduct these mukbangs online whilst eating at the dinner table. Perry regularly comments on the digital sphere and the push and pull between women's agency and the consumption of their bodies and labour, the policing of their presence in online shared spaces. The online space has become a means of financial independence for a number of women who have chosen to perform elements of prescribed femininity to a global audience. The mukbang, ASMR roleplay, influencers, and makeup tutorialists speak to the isolation many people experience and provide a digital care service for their audiences. Like many means of independence women are able to exploit, these care practices are often mocked, minimised, or discredited. Outsourcing care, luxury, ease, and plenty to the online realm seems somehow inevitable. Perry's incorporation of the digital into her IRL performance demonstrates further delegating to her audience the option to choose the more authentic performance for them. Scroll on your phone and spend time eating with an incorporeal avatar whose stylized performance will repeat precisely ad infinitum. Or, the more difficult option perhaps, to be present and examine our own reactions to the gendered performance of caregivers.
I've been really enjoying the overlap between different presentations today, and I'm hoping I'm going to offer a few more. I'm also a person using sound, so just pray for me. I'm a practice researcher in scenography, which is also known as performance design, and I teach at Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London, which is next door to the Barbican. I visited the Women's Art Collection for the first time just over a year ago. I was a new mum, a year into my matrescence, or mother becoming, and I'd come to see the Women's Art Collection while my partner and my baby son waited outside. I had as much time as I needed, which really meant as much time as I felt I could take. Being in the space and the quiet of the Women's Art Collection was a respite from the busy landscape of being a new parent and returning to full-time work in higher education. It was a breather. I breathed. I expected to encounter art. I certainly re-encountered something of myself. What I didn't expect was feminist scenography, although this is how I experienced the Women's Art Collection. And I'm going to tell you the story of this experience in 3 encounters.
Tupperware Party by Lexi Strauss. I think this is the first time I've been alone in a gallery space since Ivor was born. That's 14 months. It's so quiet here. This area is very clear and clean, and the lights are a bright, cold white. They're reflected in the glass of this painting of a man breastfeeding a baby via fake breasts or very large bottles with teats strapped to his front. The hand of the baby reaches up to one of the bottles. The tonal sterility of this space and the activity in the painting remind me of trying to feed Ivor in hospital. I'm glad to have put that period behind me. We're formula people now. The man in his suit is more effective at breastfeeding than I was able to be. Perhaps wearing a suit would have helped. Look at all that milk. Still so quiet. And the cool colours are calming, supported by the framing of the image. Imagine being able to focus on one thing, like a painting, this morning. I've briefly left motherhood to explore the Women's Art Collection, and here it is, in the first corridor I come to, my familiar friend. Ivor and Rodri are wheeling through Cambridge with a bottle of formula milk in the change bag, and there's a barely discernible hum of other people's industry elsewhere in this space. Alone. I remember what alone feels like.
Scenography is a term which embraces the atmosphere of a work of performance, This might include space, bodies, light, scent, or sound. In framing the women's art collection as scenography, I will be avoiding terms such as scenery, costumes, and lighting, in order to focus on how objects, environments, garments, bodies, and the intangible elements of sound, light, and media perform. That is, how they're all active agents within the performance event. The performance event, in this case, is where a visitor encounters the women's art collection, and this can be approached as an experience of place orientation, which is proposed by the scenographer theorist Rachel Hahn as the way that scenography works on its audience. She says, to speak of orientation is to recognise the multiplicities of phenomena that situate bodies within and with place, oscillating between internal and external influences. A scenography of place orientation is a scenography of feeling. A visitor to the women's art collection is not only subject to the feeling and impressions made on them by works in paint or print. A visitor to the women's art collection is also situated within and with the space of Murray Edwards College, which is in dialogue with influences both internal and external to the visitor. These phenomena create the experience of place orientation that signals an encounter with scenography. The curator, Carolee Thayer, suggests that curation is akin to an act of theatre direction, which invokes an approach to performance making where the direction of actors is foregrounded. Speaking as a scenographer, I feel this does something of a disservice to curation, which balances the given atmosphere of the gallery performance space with the arrangement of objects, each of which contains their own world. This proposes a raft of phenomena and relations which play around or off of the visitor, who is with space and with artwork, and suggests curation as having more in common with the practice of scenography, with all its agency to perform with or without the presence of actors. Is there a more helpful term for considering a visitor to the women's art collection as being with space and artwork? Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick considers the potential of beside, which brings me towards a framing of the women's art collection as feminist scenography. They say, the irreducibly spatial positionality of beside seems to offer some useful resistance to the ease with which beneath and beyond turn from spatial description into implicit narratives of respectively origin and telos. Telos means purpose. To be beside an artwork is to allow that meanings associated with its origin or purpose can remain unfixed and will be subject to their relation with the viewer and the context. To be beside an artwork points to the plural and particular set of circumstances within which one might find oneself at the women's art collection. One might be beside the artwork while feeling beside oneself. A visitor's experience of place orientation is refracted, or maybe diffracted, across multiple dimensions. It's this allowance for the experience of the plural and multidimensional with or beside the scenography for the encounter that renders it feminist.
Dreaming in the Bath by Lucy Ravarat. At the bottom of a flight of stairs, away from the reflective surfaces above. This corridor feels warm, subterranean, and almost domestic. The light warms the pale brick. There's a familiar smell, like the corridors by the science labs at my secondary school. A painting near the toilets and the gym. Things people do, ideally, with some privacy. The privacy of a bathroom, or a bath, or a toilet stall in a college gallery space. If that was me, I'd have put the toilet seat down first. You don't want to spend your first bath in ages staring into the toilet bowl. She came in wearing slippers, climbed in, and perhaps it's deeper than she meant it to be. Perhaps she got distracted running it. Oh, now that is like me. Running more water in to keep the temperature up. I'd tweak the tap with my toe. She is as immersed as she can be, the ripples around her head and body like thoughts. Alone. I remember what alone feels like.
Lucy Ravarat's biography in the Women's Art Collection website says that she took up painting full-time after her children started attending school. Narratives like this, embedded within the Women's Art Collection, resonate with a visitor newly returned to work in early matrescence. Looking more closely at the ripples in the bathwater, we can return to the idea of diffraction. Diffraction is drawn from quantum physics, where a wave encounters an obstacle, as with the water encountering the head of the dreamer in the bath, and responds to that obstacle by bending and spreading. Overlapping waves responding to an obstacle are described as diffraction. Dreaming in the bath diffracted some of my plural identities through its relation to place. A tired woman, a person envious of privacy or alone time, a bather with preferences for bath temperature and domestic arrangements, a new mother who previously engaged with art gallery contexts as a matter of routine, a scenographer attuned to signs and symbols. Like diffraction patterns, the identity of a visitor to the Women's Art Collection is moving, like ripples around the head of the dreamer. That diffraction overlaps with the living environment of Murray Edwards College and its changing character minute to minute. Here you're in a quiet corridor, looking at postcards on an office door, listening to your own breath. Now you're enveloped by a tour of an exhibition, or facility staff carefully making plans for improvement. Over there, someone shows a picture of their new baby to colleagues. Each encounter with a new space, a new artwork, is a new diffraction experiment. Diffraction expresses entanglement between a viewer of the artwork and the process of making meaning from it. The relation of the Women's Art Collection to the space of Murray Edwards College and the way these in turn act on the visitor set up a diffractive condition resembling the pool at the heart of the college, while also embodying the multi-sensory experience that is scenography.
It was a lovely walk through the garden. I should be getting back. Interesting to think that beyond the art accessible to a visitor, there are other pieces just for the residents and users of the library. Also in corridors, behind locked doors with safety glass. There's one. I can't tell if the figure is resting or in distress. Above that table, the relief looks like an altarpiece, lit by a fluorescent bar. Imagine if that was the image of divine focus, an exhausted woman on a rumpled bed. Mystery object in a bag underneath the table. Why do I feel it might be a head or another tiny curled body? The dimensionality of the relief invites the rest of the space into the image. Has the figure been hoovering? Is she sick of cleaning? Is she in crisis or dreaming? The softness of the bedding and the colour of her nightdress evoke the drapery of Byzantine figures just on the horizontal. Her being out of reach in a private corridor makes me feel like I've just encountered someone else's private emergency. I can't reach out, I can't get closer. For now, she has to continue laying above the table, bathed in uncompromising light, in a corridor, off of the main collection. Alone. I remember what alone feels like.
To encounter All Night Through in March 2023 was to encounter several diffracting versions of myself. The image of a female figure laying down, somewhere between rest and anguish, resonated with my experience of new parenthood. Evelyn Williams describes a desire to show how people deal with their own personal predicament, which accounts for the figure's isolation in the image and its powerful relation to a quiet, out-of-the-way corridor. The domestic markers of this encounter, the Hoover, the mystery plastic bag, staged a feminist scenography in which the predicament of the woman in the painting and the circumstances of the visitor coalesced. In her essay about the women's art collection, Reframing the Collection, Diana Petherbridge foregrounds the architecture of Murray Edwards College, celebrating in particular the private or out-of-the-way sites for artworks, saying that it's a lived-in collection where college ritual coexists with domestic imperatives or comment on tropes of confidence or female vulnerability. The scenography for my encounter with All Night Through would not have worked as powerfully if it had been staged in a main corridor, lit with exhibition lighting. It's a feminist virtue of the collection that it occupies spaces across all identities, from the municipal, domestic or practical, to those associated with knowledge, and that these encounters may be oblique, awkward, or even fail in the traditions of the practice of curation or performance design. Straining to look at All Night Through safety glass, and indeed to take a decent picture of it, in a space temporarily populated with objects associated with maintaining the building, lit by the unsympathetic light of a fluorescent tube, I encountered a scenography that resisted the careful traditions of curation, but embraced the transient conditions of performance design. You may have gathered by now that I valued my first visit to the Women's Art Collection, where I was gifted the space to be as alone as I needed to be. I've returned many times since then to absorb different pieces and new exhibitions, and also in the course of putting this paper together. I hope I've drawn attention to an overlooked dimension of the Women's Art Collection, in which feminist scenographic encounters beside artwork, through space, performance space, nourish and diffract the plural identities of the visitor, whether new parent, creative practitioner, academic, or all of these. Thank you.
We have a nice to meet you. A very big and very happy audience in front of us as well. So we're going to start off with some questions between us here on stage, and then we'll open up to questions from all of you in the audience. That was a really incredibly rich panel. Thank you all so much for your papers, which were, again, so beautifully presented and so welcome. For helping us look at the space and the works in it differently. So there's quite a lot of diversity in the papers that we've just heard, and many refractions on each other and things that kind of relate, but also things that don't, which I think speaks to the kind of wealth of the collection that we're in. But my first question, or maybe something I wanted to ask you all to respond to, was perhaps these two threads that are in or moving across all the papers, which seem to me to think through things like leisure, the possibility of leisure, or taking time out from caring responsibilities as the performers in Emily's work, or dreaming that you referred to, and aloneness and these spaces of contemplation. And then this condition of waiting and what that might open up, both in terms of anxiety, but also maybe relief and catharsis. And how those times or temporalities might suggest something outside the normative that's kind of welcome and unassailable. It can't be taken away, or we try to resist it being taken away, in comparison to these other conditions that many of the artists that you spoke about also kind of employ. They make us much more aware of the world around us. They ask us to kind of wake up and be vigilant and aware and attentive. Your idea of scenography also seemed to be playing with different forms of attention that we might have during our way moving through the college and in relation to the art collection. So I wondered if you might respond to these slightly abstract thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I think I certainly respond to the idea of the thing you highlight about being alone and being a lone viewer in Murray Edwards College. I know it must, as a building, it must experience enormous flurries of activity. You know, there must be times where it's complete bedlam, where you can't hear yourself think. But it just so happens that my particular experience of it, if you like, when I've come to see the same performance, is that it's been very quiet and very still, and it's been about kind of brief flurries of activity, and otherwise I've just floated about on my own. And then there's something about the identity of the building as a place of learning first and a place where people live that kind of means that as a visitor to the collection, you're like a sort of covert infiltrator in the nicest possible way. It's in a softer way than I've just said it. That it sort of gives you license to be sort of semi-invisible as you make your way around. And I've felt that as I've been looking at artworks and feeling people pass behind me, you know, having a kind of walking meeting or on their way to a lecture. I felt it very keenly when I was recording the narrations that were part of my presentation, that I felt like I was doing something slightly illicit. And it was the stillness of the building and that space for contemplation that kind of set that up, set that in motion. So I think from the very beginning, because of that particular set of conditions of it being very quiet and still and people being busy elsewhere, it felt almost immediately to me like a performance event coming to Murray Edwards College. And I should really, I'll keep coming back, but I should also come at a time where you're doing a performance event of the kind that Ruth was talking about, which feels like, you know, it has a completely different atmosphere to it.
Ruth, do you want to respond?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it does have a totally different atmosphere at that point. I was just thinking of Emily's performance in terms of being outside of the normative. Ostensibly, we kind of get set up with this idea of we know what we're going to get. It's going to be a guided walk or a meditation, but everything just shifts so subtly outside of the normal that it starts to put you in that more receptive state of mind, where you might start to think about the conditions that you're experiencing, and then you become aware of your own internalized views on how you're responding. And I think, having those spaces where things are just slightly off kilter help you to get into that head zone. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank you. This has been a wonderful conference, so thank you all for organizing this. And while I was listening to you, well, my experience is kind of opposite. I just visited the Women's Art Collection now. I started my research in my country, and now what I've perceived is this sense of being calm, this solitude. You know, I'm really interested in your language, in English, how you make the difference between solitude and loneliness. I think what happens here is that you kind of enjoy, you have this sense of solitude, but you're not lonely at all. You are revisiting these threads or times of others when you weave them with your own ones. So I think it has been, it is really an experience. I can connect with these threads that I was telling you about, we're all weaved in silence. You know, silence is very important nowadays to connect with what has been, with our lived times, and what we are experiencing now. Like, I think we need to be more conscious about those times, and especially if we are talking about motherhood. I mean, those the artist Francisca Aninat calls them dead moments, but I like calling them like lived times, to really bring them to our present, to make them really to connect it with our present, because otherwise they pass unnoticed. So I'm interested in those domestic moments as well, trying to connect that with our art historian narratives, of course.
Because I suppose the other connection between all three of your papers is that the context you're describing is often touching on the women's art collection itself. But Valentina, I wondered, like, if you could say, you know, coming here for the first time and seeing the work in this context, do you think it's changed any of your readings or any of the associations that you have with the work?
It really changed my point of view if I think of the experience. I mean, what happens in my country is that you see the images, the flat images, and what is really important is in these works, for example, when I saw these beetles, I was really affected by them when I saw them when I was walking during the night. And so there's something you cannot really describe through just an image, a flat image, that there's something embodied here, like you can really have a sense of what these women artists are trying to communicate. So that has been really, really important, because other narratives come out of this observation, and you know, all the building and the daylight, like having intervening the images and the artworks and the sound of the water. I was listening about the water, the flow, you know, everything connects with nowadays problematic as well, like migration flows, and how we can really think about those new narratives.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions for each other or anything you wanted to pick up?
I'd like to ask Valentina whether, only because I have colleagues who are very interested in weaving by coincidence, so they think about thread a lot. But I wondered whether that's something that, as a theme or as an element that you've arrived at through looking at Aninat's work, or whether that's a concern that kind of that threads its way through your research or your own practice, whether that's whether it's a kind of an ongoing concern, or whether it's particular to this particular artist or your work with her.
Thank you for your question. I mean, if I think about that has been always part of my life since I studied art at the university. All my artworks were connecting little traces with thread. And I think it has to do also with all our pre-Hispanic cultures, you know. We're always exposed to this, to touch textiles. I mean, we're always observing craftspeople working. Like, we have this really love for something that is handmade, how you can feel the materials. And I mean, I grew up looking and touching all of these things, and suddenly what I've been studying is that Chilean artists are more connected to these practices, and so you can see collaborative projects together with different crafts and materials, which are really, really interesting. So it's like a symptom for me. It comes back all the time. The thread is always there.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you, because now that you said that we could ask a question, that it was interesting to follow your path through Maria Edwards College and the collection. And it was interesting how you were showing this point of view outside the display. So if you can explain a bit more, if you have been, is part of your practice and your research to really be attentive to those displaced.
Yeah, it is. It's a as with thread for you, so spaces for me. My former practice before I studied and entered academia and higher education full time was that I was a stage designer. So I spent 20 years designing spaces for performance and the things that people wear in performance, which means that although I don't do that as a profession anymore, I can't help but make that almost the first thing that I think about when I'm looking at anything, including a work of art in a gallery or a museum space. And I've become really interested in that there will be, I know that there are curators beyond our organisers in this space, really interested in the parallels between scenography and performance design and curation. I think we share so much, we're really close cousins, but kind of curious about where people see the separation. We know what the difference is, if there is one. Maybe it's just to do with the materials. So I think it's sort of in my body, it's in my nature to think about the materials of space, the surfaces, the colours, the quality of light, and how these things perform. And so, hence the framing of my paper, and being unable to look at a painting just in and of itself, but thinking about where and how it is, as well as what it is.
Thank you. Well, we must open up for questions now. Are there any questions in the audience? From the audience? Yes.
Wow. Papers. And just picking up on your final comment there, could you talk a bit more about, perhaps all three of you, the relationship between space and time? Because I wonder whether that is something which separates curation from, I don't know the answer, curation from scenography in some respects. I was really interested in how performance changes the time in which art and the collection and the work of the college is experienced, and then of course time embodied in the narrative of the made artwork as well. So I just wonder whether that was something we could maybe just pick up on.
Yeah. Ruth, did you get that question?
Not quite.
So I will try and rephrase it, but it won't be as eloquent. So this is a question about the relationship between space and time. And one of the points was about this idea that a performance kind of changes the quality of time that you experience. Am I representing that adequately?
Yeah.
Ruth, I don't know if you'd like a moment to think.
Well, space and time are two of my favourite elements. So I feel as though I'm happy to go first. Yeah, I'm a fan. I think one of the things that has been most beautiful to me in moving from theatre design or performance design as a professional practice into kind of thinking and writing about it is moving away from those things and talking more holistically about scenography, which is the way that an entire atmosphere of performance performs. And so thinking about performance space as being not just a container where something else happens, but it being the actual event of performance itself. So performance space and time are intrinsically linked, because a space, as I'm enjoying understanding it now, a space happens. And I suppose the same is true in a work of theatre design for performance, and in a gallery space where the objects have been very carefully selected and arranged in order to provide a particular experience. That space happens too. So I suppose scenography is a really useful lens for considering the way that spaces perform, the way that spaces happen. And so I love your question, because I've just been able to get my rocks off talking about space and time. Thank you.
Ruth, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you. So I think time and space is quite interesting in how it affects performance, because obviously the context in which performances are occurring shift quite dramatically. Something that's relevant today will not be relevant in 5 years. We've seen quite a shift in the way that artists are creating performances, just in the sort of short history of the way that it's been talked about. So I think, yeah, definitely time is incredibly important. but that's obviously from more of an external perspective, and I guess internally, from when you are immersed in the performance. That is definitely something else that does shift how people who are experiencing it do take on what's happening and the space that it happens in. So, for example, with Emily's work, which is obviously the main reason I was talking today, well, being recorded, Emily's work shifts quite dramatically depending on where they are. She very specifically always looks to bring in people who are local to the situation, so that there is a sense of the delegated kind of authenticity of the performance. So I think, yeah, location in space is very important. And again, like I say, Emily's been doing some of her performances since 2016, and so you do start to see how those evolve and change, and how she starts to think about things slightly differently in the way that people are selected to take part in them. And then there's obviously the really interesting idea around time and space and the way that performance exchange is kind of put out one of her pieces that could be purchased, and how you actually own a performance work. And I think, all of those things come into that question. So thank you.
And Valentina, okay, yes, for me it's absolutely important. Space and time are part of my everyday life. As I was explaining, what was really important for me was to experience the collection, and the importance of this is that you, when you are in front of the collection, you can really choose where to be and what to focus on. So it connects really with, for example, I was thinking about Griselda Pollock's feminine point of view, like the gaze. You are able to choose if you are in front of an artwork, or while arriving now in London or in Cambridge, to really have the time to experience the place and to look for those surviving times. I was observing people just rushing so in a hurry, and there are so many little details to focus on. So I'm really interested in trying to focus on those details, or those fragmented images that are unseen.
Okay. What you just said about being able to choose your viewpoint within the women's art collection at Murray Edwards. I was thinking about, somebody mentioned it earlier, they were talking about the qualities of the building, being able to see artworks through other artworks reflected in surfaces, being able to, and there is a space-time thing going on in being able to look across at a corridor that you've just occupied, looking very closely at the things on the wall, and then being able to see that corridor from afar all the way across from another part of the building. And it just gives you a very acute sense of your own, of the temporality of your own journey through the building, that you can kind of observe your former self looking at that painting from different viewpoints across the space. It's a very porous building in that respect. So I think it prompts those kinds of reflections, partly because of the nature of the architecture, I think.
Exactly. It's also really funny because when you come here a lot, and we're lucky enough to come here a lot, and things move around, you start to be like, oh no, but that was there, and I remember when that was there, and so you get this kind of like weird palimpsest of different stories that circulate in the building.
That's
through the way that artworks move.
How lovely to be so intimately acquainted with it.
Yeah, and it's also something that would never really happen in a museum unless you worked there, I guess. It's just this funny, there are so many kind of random encounters or overheard conversations that then become part of your experience of the work, which is so unusual. All you get in museums is art world gossip. Nowhere near as good.
But that's also interesting because it means that the performance of engaging with these paintings, pieces of art, different works, it continues on and on. It doesn't finish. With each new rehang or a decision to swap something out, that performance continues.
Exactly.
And what is also interesting is that there are so many layers of it. I mean, you can see the artworks through the glasses, for example. There's so many, I mean, times lived inside all this gaze while you walk around the collection.
Indeed. All right, maybe one more question. I think you got there first, just to the left, or my left.
You're right. And thank you for this talk. It's been really interesting. Hi, thank you. It's about my work. Oh.
Oh, yeah. Pass it the other. And now we're on tenterhooks.
Yeah.
Yes, hello. Oh, that's loud. Thank you for today. It's been awesome. And thank you, Ruth, very much for talking about my work. It's really exciting to hear your thoughts on it. With this way of looking that you were just talking about here, I was also thinking about choice and kind of agency and your individual performances of kind of that we all have of kind of exploring the collection, but also what was in my work there. And I think what Ruth has really picked up on is this idea of choice, actually. You know, we're sort of this, I think as gallery viewers, we're often passive. We're going at the gallery pace. We're looking for an appropriate few seconds and then moving. You know, we've sort of we know the rules. And I think to interrupt that just slightly actually connects us to our agency. And that in itself feels a bit like maybe a feminist way of engaging with something, which, you know, in these moments you've had, like the moment you had is taking some time from being a mother and engaging, you know, that's sort of the performance. And this collection facilitates that by not being one room that's white and has a direct path. So, yeah, just something about agency and choice that I think at first performance or like exploring something that's not obvious can feel limiting, or like you're doing it wrong, or like it's lonely, or like there's a set way of doing it that you don't really get because that's interrupted. But actually it can then, by doing that, kind of connect you to your playfulness and your authenticity and noticing the details of the reflections and yourself in the water. And yeah, so anyway, just that.
Yeah, that's a lovely comment. Does anyone want to come in?
Yeah, I was thinking about pace as you were talking there. I was thinking about the way that we'll all approach going to an exhibition differently, but if you're in a conventional, more traditional gallery context, maybe you are a bit worried about how it appears when you race by a painting that you don't care for, or you perhaps perform interest in things because somebody else has just done the same. And I think there's something about this environment that helps you to resist that and to take a bit more ownership over where you want to head and at what pace. So I was just thinking to myself, how do I make my way through this space? And I definitely don't feel under pressure to linger if I'm not into it. It would be like, I don't know who, there'll be somebody studying the pace of people moving around exhibitions somewhere, but I was just aware that here, you're right, there is a kind of an autonomy, greater enhanced autonomy about how long you spend, how speedy you are moving through the space. I'm also really interested in being here at night, as you talked about a little while ago, you know, changing light conditions just to see how that feels.
Yeah. Ruth, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really interesting to talk about choice because so many, I think perhaps this is a real feminist strategy to play around with, framing the way that women experience time and space, because it's so fragmented and fractured and has to be very carefully kind of planned around or snatched wherever it can be. And so I think with Emily's work, and then when you put it inside the context of Murray Edwards as well, with the women's art collection, there were those moments where you felt like when you experienced the performance that you were snatching that moment quickly to enjoy that pleasurable second of looking at an artwork that perhaps you hadn't seen before. I know that when I went to the performance, you know, there were, can I step out of the boundaries? And I think she orchestrates this remarkably well, where, you know, you really think about how your time is being spent, and also perhaps about how you are performing that space as well, being the good, well-behaved participant in that, or are you going to sneak off and find moments of pleasure of your own? And I think, yeah, she sets up those dynamics remarkably well, but also the context of Maria Bros itself is sort of, and the women's art collection, you feel a little bit like you've been invited into somebody's house, even though you know it's not somebody's house. And you want to behave, but you're also intrigued. And yeah, I think the choice and agency and really getting to play around with these ideas around where your agency lies and where you might take those moments and snatch them back. Yeah, it was a beautiful place to have that. And yeah, and like I say, I believe that Emily orchestrates those things incredibly well.
Thank you. Well, I think everyone might be choosing to have a break right now, so maybe it's a good point to wrap up, and we'll reconvene for session 4 at 4:30 back in here. So thank you all, and thank you again.